unless it's a technical issue, in which case let her know and she'll let me know. And we're going to be doing another webinar in 2 weeks. That'll be the second half of this presentation. I didn't want to stop in the middle of what I was going to share. So I've broken it into 2 halves-ish, and we'll have time for questions at the end of both that way. So I will just get going. We're going to be talking about Charlotte Mason's history and our application of that for the 21st century. And I'm Emily Kiser. We've read Charlotte Mason. She says, next in order to religious knowledge, history is the pivot upon which our curriculum turns. She says that in Philosophy of Education. But what does that really mean, the pivot upon which our curriculum turns? And why did she think history was so important? Is it even that important? There are many, many Parents Review articles that ask the same question, and every single one of them defends the study of history. But it seems that it is an enduring question that has plagued people throughout history. And perhaps that's because it's not really a practical subject or an inherently beautiful one. So is the study of history still relevant for us today? And does Charlotte Mason's idea that history is the pivot of the entire curriculum, does that still hold up even though we live over 100 years later and across an ocean from where she did? So let's look at this question afresh today, and as we try and figure out the place of history in 21st century curricula. Charlotte Mason gave us criteria to assess this very thing. She insists that the mother or teacher must ask 3 things when determining the course of her students' education. She said, why must the children learn at all? What should they learn? And how should they learn it? And we can ask these same questions as we consider the subject of history. So why must children learn history at all? What should children learn about history? And how should they learn about history? Let's first look at why we should study history. Charlotte Mason says, it is a great thing to possess a pageant of history in the background of one's thoughts. When she uses this word pageant, which she does often connected with history, it should bring to mind a public display or a show, often reenacting scenes from the past full of vibrant, rich colors and drama, like the medieval parades or processions. Those things should come to your mind. In other words, it's the backdrop or the setting that we picture when we think of other times. Charlotte Mason in Volume 4 of the Home Education series says, once intellect admits us into the realms of history, we live in a great and stirring world, full of entertainment and sometimes of regret. And at last, we begin to understand that we too are making history, and that we are all part of the whole, that the people who went before us were all very like ourselves, or else we should not understand them. History is a subject which should form in the child insensibly principles whereby he will hereafter judge of the behavior of nations and will rule his own conduct as one of a nation. He goes on to say that here is a subject which should be to the child an inexhaustible storehouse of ideas, should enrich the chambers of his house beautiful with 1,000 tableaux, pathetic and heroic. And finally, history is the rich pasture of the mind, which increases upon the knowledge of men and events, and more than all, upon the sense of nationhood. So let's just look at those things again, what history should do for the student. It should give us a delightful pageant, and we discover ourselves as part of that world. And it helps us judge right action and principles for our own moral conduct, as well as being a storehouse of ideas and food for the mind. In other words, History gives us an atmosphere, a discipline, and a life. And these are the only 3 tools that we can use to educate children, Charlotte Mason says, and history provides us all 3. Miss Pennethorne, an early contributor to the Parents' Review, said, "What do we ask of history that it should do for our children? Surely that it should give them heroic ideas, hearts full of fraternity, patriotism, and the desire to do and be for the good of others. In short, we want them to see peering out through the mists of long past times the purpose that is purposed upon the earth, so that they may bear in their part in forwarding and not retarding the ultimate development of God's world." As if that wasn't lofty enough, Charlotte Mason says even more than all of this. I think we should have a great educational revolution once we cease to regard ourselves as assortments of so-called faculties and realize ourselves as persons whose great business it is to get in touch with other persons of all sorts and conditions, of all countries and climes, of all times, past and present. History would become entrancing. We should tend to become responsive and wise, humble and reverent, recognizing the duties and the joys of the full human life. In other words, history develops our science of relations, which is the end goal of education, to build relationships in as many directions as possible. So we're to hold this ideal up, keeping it before us as we develop a program of work. Those are the whys behind the study of history. Let's look at what we should learn of history. First, we're going to look at what Charlotte Mason did in her schools. There was another person who only went by the name of the initials HB, and he wrote, we know it's a man because he's referred to elsewhere as him, but that's all we know of him. But he wrote many articles on history for the Parents' Review and other things. And he said that the field of history is a large one. It can be by anyone but imperfectly surveyed. And for most of us, our scanty gleanings can afford but meager samples of an abundant harvest. We shall probably be adopting the wisest course then, should we decide upon making our approaches upon the promised land of history simultaneously from several points of attack. So instead of viewing history as one continuous thing, Mason's schools studied it as several simultaneous streams. And I hope that you got the link earlier today with the handouts. You can check your email for that if you haven't already, but this information is going to be provided for you there as well. But if you have it before you, it might just be helpful as we go through this so you can refer back to that. But just generally an overview, we're going to look at each of these streams in turn, but they studied this history of their own country, the history of a neighboring country, the history of the ancient world, current events, and finally, European history, all simultaneously. And we're going to look at each of these in turn. But if you'll notice that each stream was added in at different form levels, and that coordinates with the developmental abilities of children and also an understanding of the history they'd already studied. So let's look first at the history that they started with. Charlotte Mason in Home Education says, "Much that has been said about the teaching of geography applies equally to that of history." Well, that's helpful, but we had to go back and look at what she says about geography and the teaching. And the 2 things that she says is that it should furnish the mind with ideas, and we should begin the study with the child's own location, where he lives. The history of our own land should of all others be studied most intimately, not only in satisfaction of the rightful instincts of patriotism, but also as necessary to the citizen who would justly fill his position in the Commonwealth. That was HB again. And we should note here, when Mason or other people writing for the PNEU talk about patriotism, we need to have a right understanding of what they meant and not read that word with our American 21st century lens. And that patriotism boils down to, and being a good citizen boil down to, loving our neighbor as ourselves. Mason talks about the magnanimity and citizenship all coming down to the second great commandment. So this teaching of geography that is applying to that of history is a Charlotte Mason principle, because we move from the known to the unknown and from the concrete to the abstract. So starting with the child and where he is helps him know what he knows, and then he's going to branch out from there. So it's important for us to begin with our own geographical locale, so the history of our own country. Our own country's history begins in the first year of school and is studied every single year throughout all of the school life of a child. Charlotte Mason said, English history is always with us, but only in the earliest years is it studied alone. So what does this look like in practice? Well, in first grade, there was a great emphasis on stories. These stories were still read chronologically, but they were tales highlighting men and their deeds. Charlotte Mason referred to this as the heroic age. HB again says the stories themselves might preferably be culled from the Bible, from history and heroic tales of Greece and Rome, from the history and legends of our own land, and especially those of our own neighborhood, where each incident may be illustrated on the spot where it occurred. And in the programs, we do indeed see all the history and legends of our own land, Bible, history, mythology as well. Charlotte Mason wrote that the early history of a nation is far better fitted than its later records for the study of children, because the story moves on a few broad, simple lines. So this early history of a nation is a bit shadowy and dim. What comes down to us is often the stuff of legends. We don't worry about connecting the dots between the stories. There might be long periods where we don't know what's happening exactly, but we do present them chronologically. So we don't jump around and just pick and choose heroes from our country's history. It is that early part before we have a continuous chronological record. So on the streams of history chart, the first year of school studies tales from the early history of our own country. And you see this in a program. Charlotte Mason wrote that the child of 6 in 1B has a definite quantity of consecutive reading, confined to the first third of the book, embodying the simpler and more direct histories. Many of you are familiar with Our Island Story, and that's the book she's referring to here. And then in 1A, so second and third grade, 1A reads from the rest of the book and learn at any rate to love English history. Here is a picture of what a PNEU program looks like, just zoomed in on the history portion. And you see, even though B is the first year of school, it's listed second. We don't know why. But you see they're reading the very beginning of Our Island Story, while Form 1A is reading much later in the book. So what Form 1A here, reading from the rest of the book, that is was covered about 1000 AD until the time of its publication, a little after 1900. And Charlotte Mason's referring to that time as authentic history, because it is more detailed and we have a continuous written chronicle of what was going on in history. In Form 1A, the history is amplified and illustrated, Charlotte Mason tells us, by short biographies of persons connected with the period studied. Tales from Westminster Abbey and from St. Paul's help the children immensely in individualizing their heroes. So we see that biography is an important part of history study, because when we study one person's life, that child the student is able to connect to real men and women who really lived. And we're most familiar with people. So that's, again, moving from the known to the unknown. Charlotte Mason also tells us that the life of a single man can give a picture of the whole age in which he lived. And these connections help form those deep relationships that we're after as a goal of history study. So again, our streams of history chart. The first year is that darker blue box is tales. And so you see that the second and third grades, the Form 1A, are doing a chronological study of their own country from authentic history. So let's just recap that in Form 1, we need to start where the child is, both geographically and developmentally. They start with story because that's what they're most familiar with and most in tune to. So in Form 1B, they have the tales of the early history of their own country. And then in 1A, they study the chronological history of their own country from a spine book and also add in biographies of persons connected to that time. HB again tells us that their idea of time is a very narrow one. It is therefore not to be wondered at that any complete idea of time should be entirely beyond the comprehension of a child of tender years. And he's speaking of up to 7 or 8 years old. So developmentally, we don't need to worry about putting all of those tales into the right dates. We present them chronologically, Charlotte Mason tells us, but we don't need to be worried about the details because that's beyond their developmental ability at that age. Let's talk about Form 2 now. So Form 2B, 4th grade, Charlotte Mason says, we introduce children as early as possible to the contemporary history of other countries, as the study of English history alone is apt to lead to a certain insular and arrogant habit of mind. Naturally, we begin with French history. Such a knowledge of the history of France as throws light on that of our own country and certainly gives them the sense that history was progressing everywhere, much as it was at home during the period they are reading about. So the principle here is that we start with one country because it's impossible at first because of time to study everywhere, but we want to give them that specific knowledge before general. So instead of studying what was going on in the rest of the world at the same time, that we're studying our own country, we're going to focus in on just one other country. So on the streams of history chart, they continue the study of their own country and chronologically moving forward, and contemporary history. I'm going to use that word contemporary a lot. Mason did, and it means, don't think modern when we hear contemporary, think concurrent, like whatever historical time period you're studying in your own country, you're studying that contemporary or concurrent historical time in the neighboring country. So on the program, we see here that there's English history and now French history, and A and B, again, B starts with the stories of their neighboring country. We have stories from French history there on the left in the middle, while the upper part of Form 2 reads the chronological, and you see the note to be contemporary with English history right there in the middle under their history book. So this gives them the idea that history is in the making everywhere at the same time, that there are similarities and also differences, and helps expand their idea. It keeps them from being insular and arrogant. I also have up here, just so you can see, because that the study of ancient history is added in Form 2, but not until Form 2A. If you look down on the left, that image, you see that only A has general history, and they use the British Museum book for children. Charlotte Mason talks about that book extensively in her volumes. She talks about the chronologically arranged British Museum book for children, but she also mentions, when studying ancient history, Plutarch. Well, Plutarch is of course, in the programs, but it is always listed under citizenship and not under history. She says that Plutarch, because he's writing biographies, he's showing us the lives of men who lived, is the best preparation for study of Grecian or Roman history. So they begin in Form 2B with this general stories from the history of Rome, which is a very the retellings of the most famous incidents from Plutarch, just as a little introduction to Plutarch. And then in Form 2A, they start reading the actual lives. And that is the same year then that they add this general history, this ancient history, I'm going to call it, just to keep our terms separate and clear in our mind. So I thought that was all that they did originally. That was my understanding, because I'd read in her volumes that they do Plutarch, they read this British Museum book, they do their neighboring country, they have English country or English history as well. But I had a little surprise when I started poring over the programs. If you notice on the very bottom of your screen, there's a book called The Ancient World by A. Mallet. And I found that book online, and it's an actual ancient history spine. And they worked their way through this regularly at about the same clip, the same number of pages that they were reading their English history book. But I noticed that the spine is arranged by culture chronologically, not like Story of the World, many of you might be familiar with, where it's trying to give a snapshot of what's going around in the whole entire world at about the same period. The spines that she chose for ancient history, or general history as she called it, were the history of Assyria, the history of Egypt, and you would read a continuous portion from each of those cultures before moving on. So you get a fuller picture of one culture before doing another. So here on our Streams of History chart, we see that we're continuing our own country's history in Form 2. We're adding our neighboring country, and then in 5th grade, the upper part of Form 2, we have a chronological study of ancient history as well. Charlotte Mason did tell them that tell us that the Form 2 has a more considerable historical program, which they cover with ease and enjoyment, and they use a more difficult book than in 1A. And she did tell us that Plutarch was the best preparation for study of history, but they did also have this ancient history spine. So let's move on to Form 3. Here is a picture of a part of their program. They have the same history book actually as Form 2, but they're having an addition of current events. You see here that they're to read the daily news and keep a calendar of events. And then right above that little orange box just make a note that make a chart for the 11th century from 1000 to 1100. Just file that back in your mind. We'll talk about that later. So these the events are not really a separate stream, but they were studied every term, the news of the day. And I did put it on our Streams of History chart because I wanted to be able to show you the depth of the history studies that a child in Mason School would be getting. They would be getting the history of their own country, the history of a close neighbor, ancient history at the same time, as well as the most current history, what was going on in the world today. Now, Form 3 is definitely a transition time developmentally for children. Some things are more like the elementary students that they just graduated from. And you see that they're actually reading the same history book as Form 2. But some things they're starting in Form 3 that they're going to carry on through all of high school, and that current events is one of those. Okay. So we're going to talk now about the other 3 forms, which encompass what we call today high school, 9th through 12th grades. And I just want to make a note real quick here that in Charlotte Mason's day, mostly girls were in Forms 5 and 6 because boys would have gone on to university or preparatory school at that time, or had gone to trade school and had entered profession. So not as many boys had continued in her schools. Yet she still gives a rigorous and broad feast for these girls who no one would have guessed, or considered that they would go on to either higher education or anything other than being a wife and mother. But she still gives them that feast. We also have fewer programs available online. They do exist, but not a lot of them have been digitized. And so I'm going to be discussing all three forms together because they have mostly the same characteristics as far as their history studies go. So in Form 4, Charlotte Mason tells us in Volume 3 that the history of modern Europe instead of French history, the literature to illustrate the history includes the reading of good many books, and the German and French books, when possible, illustrate the history studied. And then in Volume 6, she tells us that they use a somewhat stiffer book than they have been hitherto engaged upon. So here we see in Form 4 or 9th grade that we're moving outward. Yet again, we started with our own country's stories, and we broadened a little bit to talk more about the definite events and people who lived in our authentic history. And we moved out a little bit from that in Form 2B with the study of a neighboring country, and we moved out again to encompass ancient history. Then in Form 3, we add current events. We're taking another step out. Instead of just doing that one close neighbor, we're going to be looking at all of Western civilization. And in Forms 5 and 6, the history studies of Forms 5 and 6, ages 15 to 18, are more advanced and more copious and depend for illustration upon readings in the literature of the period. It is not possible to continue the study of Greek and Roman history in detail, but an admirably written survey is used. She says this in Philosophy of Education, Volume 6. So I was kind of surprised at myself that I didn't pick up on earlier that they were using a detailed history, because she says they no longer have time for one. They're still going to use a survey, though, for ancient history. So let's just briefly look at all of these three forms. They're going to be doing contemporary European history instead of just one country's history besides their own. They're going to continue all those streams that they had started, and they're going to use a survey of ancient history instead of that detailed history. So the streams of history chart, you see these streams that they've been going through that we're familiar with by now, but that neighbor drops off and picks up in European. So I've listed it separately, but really that European stream is just a continuation of the neighboring countries. There's really just these three main streams: our own country, our neighboring country, and the ancient world, as well as current events. But like I said, that's not really a stream because it's always what's happening today. So this is a broad feast of history that Charlotte Mason thought her students needed and deserved. But it's not shallow. It's gradually unfolded, and that leads to great depth of understanding and connection as well. So that's what Charlotte Mason assigned for study. Let's look at how she thought we should learn history. We have a couple tools at our disposal. First of all, books. This is what she says about them. It should be of sufficiently literary character. It's a hallmark of history books. Imagination does not stir at the suggestion of the feeble, much diluted stuff that is too often put into children's hands. Let the child have the meat he requires in his history readings and in the literature, which naturally gathers round this history, and imagination will bestir itself without any help of ours. The child will live out in detail 1,000 scenes of which he only gets the merest hint. He should linger over the history of a single man until he thinks the thoughts of that man is at home in the ways of the period. Though he is reading and thinking of the lifetime of a single man, he is really getting intimately acquainted with the history of a whole nation for a whole age. And as if that wasn't enough, she tells us that there is nothing which calls for more delicate tact and understanding sympathy with the children than this apparently simple matter of choosing their lesson books, and especially, perhaps, their lesson books in history. So they have to have literary quality. They must stir our imaginations, be full of neat, those wonderful living ideas, and we should use biographies. In other words, we must use living books, and we have a great duty to ensure that they are well chosen for the children. And then our other tool is things. Miss Pennethorne again says, every possible aid should be given to the children's imagination. The ideas being given simply and the pictures vividly, so that the children may be able to make a chart of the century they are studying and fill the small square allowed for each year with little pictures, drawn by themselves, of the events which have struck them most. Anecdotes, pictures, connection with places familiar to them, references to events in their own experience illustrating the same forces at work, and an incidental coupling of some great man with some great epic should help the children to get a grip of the world's progress. So these history charts are really important. They and the pictures that we give, because they're visual mnemonic devices. And hopefully, if you all don't have a ton of questions, I might be able to show you some examples, because I've been getting a lot of questions about history charts. But I think a thing that we often overlook in the history things is the use of pictures and maps. And over in many Parents Review articles I've come across, the authors talking about the teaching of history mention and emphasize the use of pictures of a place, of a time, to give children so they could fill their imagination with that. Not just the descriptions in books, but actual pictures and maps, again, so they can place where in the world they're talking about. Because as you see, there's all these streams. We're talking about different countries, and getting that idea of where the story or history book was happening is important. So also, I think most of us are familiar that Charlotte Mason schools use the Book of Centuries. But I think now you might be a little more understanding of why it was not until Form 2A or 5th grade that the Book of Centuries was introduced. Some people say, oh, it's because of their handwriting, but really it's because that's when ancient history is started, and so all of those 3 streams of history were being studied at the same time. So all of these streams of history are coalescing in the Book of Centuries. It's much more than a timeline. It's how a child synthesizes all of their history learning. And always under history, Charlotte Mason emphasized that when they kept the Book of Century, they were to put in drawings from all periods of history that they were studying, including Bible history. So the biblical narratives that they're reading in their Bible lessons would also be information, facts, and ideas that they could put in their Book of Centuries as well. And that's going to connect what was happening in the Bible. They're reading that as a history book as well, even though it's not in the history portion of their school day. But by doing that, and then also always studying ancient history, fitting those together and seeing, wow, these things I'm reading about really did happen, and this is its relationship to one another. But the emphasis from the first is on the drawing and not so much on the charts, although those were filled in. And because this book was designed to be kept for the remainder of life. And when you're just starting out, you don't have perspective about what the most important events. You might think every single book you have to put all of these details, and that's not true. The child was free to add what they thought was the most intriguing, interesting, and that would idea on those charts, and that would get honed as they grew older. So we have the Book of Centuries. And then do you remember when I said keep that little snippet from the program for Form 3 in your mind? They did history charts, and the charts that she mentions in the programs began in Form 3 were century charts, but there are other charts that lead up to those that must have scaffolded a child's ability to keep a century chart and what that looked like. But they were developed primarily by Miss Beale, who wrote an article for the Parents Review that was reprinted several times after her death. And she said, since 100 years is about the limit of a man's life, and we generally speak of centuries in history, we take for biography or for history a square divided into 100 squares. And if we have time today, I can show you some examples of that. But I think we're going to pause here and see if there's any questions. And then in 2 weeks, I will dig much more deeply into our specific dates for our rotations of history and what all of the cycles within these streams are. But I want to be able to do that in one fell swoop. So I'll stop here today for questions, and maybe we can talk about history charts some more.
Okay. I only see one question so far, and it's from Danielle, and it's on the Facebook page. And she says she has a question about Form 3. In Volume 6, she says that the students also did Indian history, a distant part of the English Empire. What role did this play in their programs, and is it applicable to our place and time?
Right.
Not necessarily Indian history specifically, but some distant country.
Okay. Well, I did not work that into our plan because I do not see a correlation, a direct correlation to that for us Americans. We don't have an empire, pretty much, I guess. That may be arguable, but we haven't taken over. Well, I should probably not say that either. Taken over another person's government, another country's government. But those were always stories of English or of Indian history. So again, they kind of function as those tales from the heroic age, those notable stories. And it was also always optional. It wasn't a mandatory part of the program. So since there isn't a direct correlation for Americans today, and we already have all of this to get into our 5 days a week school, I did not add that. However, I often get asked about the fact that Mason only studied Western civilization, and that's a concern. And I'm going to talk more about the implications of all of these streams and kind of address this again in 2 weeks. But briefly, just wanted to mention that that is out of respect for other cultures. Mason knew that we didn't have time in our school day, in our school years, to really understand another country's history in as much depth as it requires for understanding. And so she thought if we just did a cursory overview of Chinese history or Japanese history, we might have the arrogant idea that we do know it, but we don't really, because we haven't had the time to invest in it. So she would often put stories from other cultures like that on Sunday reading and just have it as a separate part of the day, a part of the week that was set aside for itself. It was special. She wasn't discounting or saying these other cultures weren't important, but because she did have reverence for them, she thought if we could better understand ourselves, we would be better able to understand another country as well. And so that was where that was covered.
Okay. It was covered a bit in geography as well, like what we have in, Little Folks of Many Lands and things like that.
More cultural stuff, but as far as like an actual chronological survey of their history, we don't see that in her programs.
Right. Okay. Heather Johnson says she'd love to see some examples from the Book of Centuries, because she's having trouble moving beyond list making.
Well, do we have time? Because I have some examples, and
We've got 10 minutes.
Okay. So if there aren't any other questions on this part, I will show you what I have. I think there are, there's a lot. There's Lori Bessbotter wrote The Living Page, which talks about all of the different kinds of history charts that are mentioned in the volumes, as well as some Parents Review articles. And it can get really confusing because they weren't all very descriptive, or they don't have the same name in all places, or you'll hear two people using the same name and talking about two different things, it sounds like. So I've been wading through the Parents Review and all the mentions in Mason's own work about the charts, and we do know they were important and that they were used. But I think there's two basic ideas. First, that a child is developing a sense of the linear progression of time. And HB, who I mentioned earlier, he wrote extensively and did get very detailed instructions about some charts. And I think his charts really help a child develop that understanding of the progression of chronology. And then what we hear most often referred to are Miss Beale's charts, and that's what they began in Form 3, keeping a century chart 100 squares ruled like 10 by 10 columns. And hers used symbols and was supposed to be a visual mnemonic device, so a child could close their eyes just like they do for reading lessons and picture study and dictation, and see the chart, and it would help trigger the relation of events. So I think there's actually two things going on, in that there's charts that help develop both. And I think actually the Book of Centuries falls more into the first camp of that. And you'll notice they don't start the century charts until Form 3, but they do start the Book of Centuries in Form 2. So I think it's a progression. I think these charts help scaffold one another and help scaffold a child to understand their various uses. So let's look at what HB talks about. He mentions just using a piece of ruled paper to make a child's own history chart. But he talks about doing this in that the mom would sit down and make a family history chart. So I did one for our family. I had to put 3 pieces of paper together. He talks about using 1 line of notebook paper for 3 months. So 4 lines together would be a year, and then you would make a thicker line. And after 5 years, you would make a really thick line. And after 10 years, you would make a double line. And so just like this is preparation for the Book of Centuries, because they're getting practice at seeing like this column, the middle column, and the other column, each being a month. So and he talks about entering birthdays and family events, and then finally entering national events or world events onto that. So as he said, simultaneously that the mom was working on this, you would have your child take a piece of paper and he would work on his own. And he said that this should be around the age of 8 or 9 years old, and starting with the present, so his 8th or 9th year, and moving backwards into family history. That's going to help him understand that where I am today, there's things that led up to that, and that's generally gently going to get the idea that history is progressing, and he's a part of it. So while the mom is making this longer chart for their family, he could work on one that was about the length of time as his life and start filling in those things that had happened most recently to him, and then moving backwards. And since it's divided into months, you can get really specific and be like, I got a pet turtle and it happened in March of this year, you know, or we went to visit grandma in Maine and we, you know, in this year. So he's able to do that. But I like the idea that you're not just giving it to the child. You're not doing it for the child. You're doing one and he's watching you, and then he's able to do his at the same time. So around 8 or 9 years old, he would start that. And then he talks about a table of history, and Erin at Riverbend Press actually has these, and she tells me she's going to put them on her website for sale. It's very large. You could hang it on a wall, and it's HB talks about it as the table of history. Mason describes it, I believe, in volume 1, where you would have like the 30 centuries. And then you would have BC and AD. And this is where you would just write the name or a very important event down the column, just to generally get an idea of this happened first, this happened later, how close was Alexander to when Jesus was walking around on earth. So getting an idea of the flow. Now this is big, it's about 9 feet long, but that's not too long for a child to be able to see the whole thing all at one time. And it's simple, it's not like a timeline that's winding through many rooms of your house. I've seen lots of those, like a string and hanging timeline figures. It's really just getting, okay, so we read about this person in our island story and this person in our American spine book. And so we can put them in and see where they are. And then as we start ancient history, we'll start adding those people as well, but we can add, you know, the kings and the prophets from the Bible time too, and that. And then HB talks about making a condensed chart where it's more like a century. Okay, so, and he said one line should not stand for more than 10 years. I did 50 and did 2 lines for each century. So this is where a child could then, after they've kind of got those people on, they might start to have a general idea of what was going on in a century, and they just briefly write a few things. Again, something that this covers from the 21st century back to the 14th century BC on 2 pieces of paper. So having that picture in your mind. I think all of that leads up to, very naturally, the Book of Centuries. If a child had made his own history chart, and seen family events and then seen world events that had happened at the same time, and then started to take the people that he had studied in history and put them on the stream of history and seeing how they relate, he's going to start to get the idea that people lived at different times, that things were happening at different centuries, and that's where the Book of Centuries comes in. I have been reading about architecture. So I put a little drawing of the Greek classical architectural orders on this page. And this might be all that your child focuses on at first. If they don't have a developed understanding of the flow of history, you're just going to help them find the appropriate page that an artifact was produced in, and they can do a drawing of it on the blank page. And then across from that is the chart. And I do have, because I'm doing this architecture book and my drawings are about architecture, I thought it would be interesting to put in the dates that the Acropolis was built and the other temple that I do not know how to say the name of, the Erechtheum, I don't know how to say it. And also when Phidias, the sculptor, was born and died, and Pericles, who was the statesman at the time. So that's all in the 5th century BC. So the goal is not to fill in the chart. You can read an article about the Book of Centuries by Mrs. Burnau, who developed them for use. And she talks about that the child would fill in those dates for the rest of their life. And so they don't have an idea when they first start out of what the most important things are. So just, you know, occasionally, but that it was a source of great delight for them, and that it was that all of their history would be material that they could use. They don't have to just focus on that ancient stream. They could be working at multiple places in their Book of Centuries at one time. The other idea in history charting are the century charts that Miss Beale talks about. And those, again, are to help us have a visual memory of where things are. And so this chart you can print off for free from Riverbend Press. They have a resources tab, and there's century charts is one of them, and you can get them formatted a little differently depending on how you want to use them. But again, Miss Beale talks about starting with the child's own life. And so I rolled this one and put the numbers so my child could start to see. Hypothetically, he's only 2, so he doesn't have a whole lot to put on his. But hypothetically, he'd get used to seeing which square, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that when I saw a century chart, I would naturally know that the row below the center line was the 50s, and that the space after the center line is the 5th. So year 55. And again, this is going to be for a life. So instead of it standing for a century, she said it could either stand for a man's life or a century. For the man's life, this is the first year of his life up to age 1. And this is the second year of his life up to age 2 when he's 1 year old, and going on to the time that he's 99. So this can be any person's life. I did one for myself. Miss Beal actually talks about leaving space in the margin. Can you see that? Where you can actually write the anniversary or birthday dates or important dates. And here you'll notice, though, instead of me writing out, Phidias was born or Jonah was born, there's symbols. And you have freedom to come up with what those are. But it's more of a picture, a trigger for your mind to know what was happening. And then I think the next progression from once a child has learned how to read a chart like that, how to put his life on it, you could take a century chart and use it along with a biography you're reading. So say you're reading about Florence Nightingale. Here is where she's born. I drew a little map of Italy. She was born in Italy. And then when the next year of her life, they moved back to England. When she was, 16, she heard a call from God of what she wanted to do in her life. She took a trip to Europe when she was 18. Here she started training to be a nurse. The war in the Crimea broke out. Here she goes to the Crimea. I drew a little map of the Crimea and my little red cross to show that she was a nurse there. She wrote a book on nursing, opened a school for nursing, and then finally she died at the age of 90. So you see that this century chart is really just for her life. Then after that, you could take a century chart to actually stand for a century. And I think doing 2 contemporary people who lived at the same time. So here I have Florence Nightingale was born with the little star, and I put her initials. Thomas Jackson or Stonewall Jackson was born at the same time too, like just a few years later. So I put a few of their events currently. So you're seeing how at the same time in history, multiple things are happening. And then from there, the child could start in Form 3 to chart a century with the most important political events. You see how that's a progression from starting with where the child is, and then moving out to a life of one other person, and then maybe a century where there's a couple people, and then a century of all of these events. That was started in Form 3. So I think if you work on those charts, the HB ones, the first ones I showed you, these could be begun in Form 1A and work on those up to starting the Book of Centuries in 5th grade. So you have several years to work on that idea. And then you can start teaching the Inform, maybe you spend 6th grade after they've gotten used to the Book of Centuries for a little bit. You start teaching them how to use the century chart with the 100 squares and using symbols instead of just writing out all of the details, and then working on those in Form 3 for a century. Then both Beal and HB talked about giving the child a chart that has all of the centuries on it on one sheet of paper with just a very characteristic. I took this mostly from Beal. I added something for the 20th century, which was blank. I put technological advance. I had a really war with myself because I didn't know if I should put ideological wars as also a characteristic of the 20th century. But we see Christianity and good emperors and military despotism, Constantine, the fall of Rome, just so they could see in one page. It's kind of like a very, very abbreviated, just to give them a toe hold or a hook to hang things on as they read. So that would be after they had learned how to use a century chart, you would kind of help them get the idea that each century kind of has its own characteristics. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Can I piggyback on that a little bit? So I used a book of centuries with my kids at Willow Tree, and people are wanting to know about the size of the drawings. Like, they get how to use I'm going to write what happened in what year. I just don't know what the drawing should look like. And she used artifacts a lot.
Primarily, yeah.
But she also said if there was a certain thing that a child was interested in, they could concentrate on those. Like, put it, like if they liked the costumes or the weapons, then in a certain part of their book of centuries, like in the corner, they could put what the weapons looked like or what the dress looked like in that century. But I thought I would show you a more finished page. Like, after we finished studying this century, this is what my book of centuries looks like. So I'm trying to see that with you. So I've got there we go. Different people, different things that were going on, and across the top I've got who was leading where, and then over here I'm interested in philosophy, so I put the pervading ideas of that century. That's what I was interested in. And then, just to kind of help me keep up, and I do encourage parents to keep their own book of centuries too. So, this, can you see that? Yeah, family tree of the British royalty and how they were related to other royalty in Europe and things like that. And then on the other side, you've got the events, and it doesn't just come from history reading, it comes from science reading too.
And literature.
Yeah, anything that you're reading. So I thought that might be helpful to see a little fuller page. And I usually just told my kids, you're going to be using this for a long time, so don't take up a whole page with one picture.
Let me show you, because I don't think it's digitized and available to everybody, but here is the Parents Review article by the originator of the Book of Centuries. So this is drawings on an example book that she has. So they can be pretty detailed, right? And here are some more. And she talks about the student might be interested in a certain kind of thing, like musical instruments or hunting implements or eating utensils or clothing, and to do those as much as you can throughout the centuries. And that might, I mean, I think I've known, like, my brothers were kind of crippled by that idea at first, because they didn't want to mess up. They didn't want to change their mind later. And I think that can kind of evolve. You have a lot of centuries to fill up. And so as the child's looking for artifacts, I think they're going to figure that out for themselves. So I don't necessarily think you should hit them up with that right off the bat. The other thing I noticed, this is hers, Mrs. Burnau, who came up with this. She starts writing in the column, but she would continue it on. So if she had more words, like 5 words, and she couldn't fit them in just the column for that year, that's fine. It bled over. So I thought that was helpful to know too, that you don't have to just confine yourself to one word in those charts. You could have it just start in the appropriate square and go over. Now, of course, you're running into the risk that you're going to find out something and this space will already be filled. But she said that it's not necessary to be an artist. I'm going to find this thing, but neatness. And oh gosh, she said something else. I read a lot of pages on this, but really neatness and accuracy. were the two important things. So as long as your child is doing it neatly, they're going to do this for their life. It may change, but yeah, not covering up the whole page with one image, because they're going to want to leave room for other things that they encounter later. But being accurate about what it looked like and putting it in the right century as well is important.
All right. We're just about at our time limit, but Emily, I want to read a couple of questions that people had, or comments that people had, and it may be that you could put together something that we could put on the webpage, or these might be things that you want to address in your talk in 2 weeks when we come back and revisit this. But here's one question. If you have an older student starting out, would you begin where they are, or would you begin with the charts from the earlier forms first? That's a great question.
I think I should address that really quickly, Jen.
Go ahead.
Okay. So yes, we begin with the child where they are. That's the Charlotte Mason principle. That's inviolable. We have to begin where they are. I think an older child is going to pick up the idea of chronology so much quicker. So if you look at the two different types of charts I showed you, like the HB charts versus the Beale charts, the HB charts are a little more straightforward, and an older child would probably pick them up much quicker. And those, I think, naturally lead into the Book of Centuries, which they're doing in Form 2 anyway, right? 2A. So I think they can get there sooner. You don't have to spend, like 3 or 4 years working on it before they can do that. But I would have them start with the history of their own life. And I would, they would probably progress faster to adding in those political events from around the country and around the world. But they should start with where they are and have that idea first, I think. They could even put themselves in their Book of Centuries. Like, I was born in this year, because in their Book of Centuries, that's probably the most important thing. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist.
That's right. Yeah.
And then work up. I think I would work up to the century chart. So obviously, you cannot require a child to be able to do a century chart if they've never seen one and understand that these squares are to be little symbols, and this is how we're putting all of these events into a life. And so I would not worry about doing a whole century chart for a Form 3 student if they are just starting Charlotte Mason and have done no other history charts at that time.
Okay. So people are wanting to know if you could maybe upload photos of those charts so they could look at them longer when they have time to really study them. They're wondering about the notes behind making them, which I'm assuming they're asking about the Parents Review articles. So I don't know if there might be a way to link to those.
Sure. I can get links to the ones that are published.
Good.
Yep.
And then somebody asked, this year's election would be in current events. Any ideas for the upper forms other than reading newspapers and keeping a notebook?
I think, well, okay, so the upper forms. So you're going to be doing century charting. If you've never done century charting before, they would be starting with the history of their life, right? And so those current events could easily fit into their HB. He talks about keeping horizontal, like birthdays always at the top, family events in the middle, and then putting world and political events on the bottom of the space. That's why I used wide ruled notebook paper instead of college ruled notebook paper, because I can't write that small. So they could have their birthdays and family events, and then on the bottom of those lines they could put in various things as they followed the political thing. But as far as current events, she just asked them to keep a calendar. So maybe like a planner or some kind of calendar notebook, and just writing a little bit about what was going on every day as they read the news.
Okay. Something else just came in. Let's see what that was.
And as far as the details about the history charts, I am preparing to be able to do a whole presentation on history charts. So you guys have just been my little guinea pigs today, the beginning stages of having that. So that all will probably be forthcoming.
Good. Good,
over
because
this year.
yeah, somebody is asking now. She's thinking about the instructions for how to use these history charts, and she says the PR articles are great, but it might take a while to ferret out the steps, and that is true.
Yep, I am working on that, guys.
Good. All right, we should probably close out. We're about 15 minutes over what we said we were going to do, and I want to keep you guys. Thanks for hanging in there with us. Thank you, Emily, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge of history. We look forward to hearing from you again in a couple of weeks and figuring out the best way maybe to give people access on the website or something to what you've gone over today. If you didn't hear already, we are not happy with Webinar Jam, and we're looking at another platform, and we'll probably have that in place by next week. So we'll have to deal with the learning curve again, but I think it will be better because this platform's been really glitchy. But I appreciate your patience in dealing with that. So I hope everybody has a great day, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.